Hey, well, here we are. Festival, second week, and this is my favorite event of the festival. It's Incubator Night, and this is a chance to hear from the researchers that have taken some research funds from the Halloran Trust and done really exciting things. So we're going to hear from our two current incubators tonight. The first one is focusing on infrastructure, and I'll introduce the researchers shortly. And the second one is focusing on a very important issue of Aboriginal housing, and we'll hear from them starting at about 5:30 from that research team. So look, before I begin, can I just acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, and in my case, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. You might like to put in the chat the Aboriginal land that you're listening to this session from. But it's upon these ancestral lands that University of Sydney is built, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So look, let me introduce the two researchers that are going to talk to us about their infrastructure incubator tonight. And first one on my immediate left here is my colleague, Associate Professor Turan Alizada, who's based here at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. She's the lead investigator on this project, which we're calling the Infrastructure Governance Incubator. And Turan's going to tell you about the project shortly. And Turan's, for a long time, has had a research at the intersection of urbanism, particularly telecommunications planning. You might have seen her or heard her in the NBN space, where she's been a very active commentator for many years. Now, joining Turan on Zoom this evening is Dr. Crystal Legacy, who's also working on the incubator. Crystal's a senior lecturer in urban planning at Melbourne University. Crystal's published widely on the topics of urban transport, strategic planning and urban policy, and particularly around the issues of politics of citizen participation in infrastructure planning, which she's been a national leader in. So look, without any further ado, we're going to hear from Turan and Crystal for about 15 minutes, and then there's a real chance for you to ask some questions. This is the start of Turan's incubator. She's very much interested, I think, in feedback and engagement from you, the festival audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get a chance to listen and discuss those with Turan at the end of the talk. So Turan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our incubator with the audience tonight. It would be great if I could have the slides on. Thank you. As Peter mentioned, tonight I will be talking about the most recent incubator project funded by the Halloran Trust. And my goal for tonight is to actually articulating and describing what I believe that is a very timely research agenda, focusing on infrastructure governance at times of crisis. As Peter was mentioned, I also feel like it is important to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are gathering on tonight. In my case, I live, work, and pretty much I have my life on the Gadigal land of Eora Nation. So my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's my great honor, and I feel like it's an opportunity to once again thank the Trust for putting their trust in us with this amazing project. It's been a bumpy and long road, if you like, for us to get to this position, but I feel like everything that we went through got us to this position of having the most timely opportunity to talk about infrastructure and infrastructure governance. Infrastructure is always a very important topic, but when you think about the post-COVID time, when you think about the pandemic hit recovery and the very special role that infrastructure needs to play as a stimulus, it couldn't be a better time. In saying so, I'm very happy to be part of a multidisciplinary collaborative team. Yes, I'm leading the project, but it is something that wouldn't be possible without the support of my colleagues based at the University of Sydney, Monash, and also Melbourne University. I'm going to introduce them in a sec, but before that, I have to say that we have just started reaching out for industry partners. And we are very happy to report that Planning Institute of Australia, both New South Wales and Victoria branches, have already agreed to come on board as our official partners. We're very happy to have them on board and look forward to 3 years of constructive and fruitful collaboration. So, with my colleagues, as I said, we have some of the most outspoken and well-known people on the subject. Glenn Searle, Glenn is known to so many people who knew him via his work at here at UTS, then University of Queensland, and now at the University of Sydney. Lytton used to be at QUT, now at Monash. Crystal Legacy, and finally Rebecca Clemens, who is our postdoc. We are very happy to have Rebecca on board and look forward to work very productively together. Okay, so if we want to go back to the core of what motivated us to put this incubator together, there is no, sugarcoating around this. There's been at least 3 decades of, neoliberal orthodoxy, which has resulted in an approach to infrastructure as commodity, which is very much detached from the place's quality, detached from the people that it's supposed to serve, detached from its adjunct land uses. And as a result, there is a gulf between strategic plans and the infrastructure projects, and especially their deliveries. And the way that we understand it in this incubator, the most important challenge is that when you have that sort of approach to infrastructure, it is very unclear who infrastructure is supposed to serve or to what end. When I say what end, I'm talking about other global challenges that never go on hold. Things like climate change, things like, the increasing level of inequity and inequalities in our cities and regions. And what happens at time of crisis? When something like COVID happens, it only exacerbates all of these, pre-existing challenges. And yet there's been a lot of talk, in the media about the fact that policymakers should use this as an opportunity to, build, and future-proof basically us by making the right infrastructure investment. But the reality is that the right infrastructure investment is required, as certain types of infrastructure have stronger benefits, in assisting us in recovery and, bulletproofing our future. And if you want to know, what kind of right infrastructure I'm talking about, for us, there are, a set of criteria. To what end? Will we use this as an opportunity to have climate change ready future? And the sort of infrastructure that help us to decrease the level of inequity and inequality, basically something that helps everyone. And who's going to be funding it? Because if we are going to rely on private sector, doing the heavy lifting for funding, then we're going to end up with a lot of user pay kind of infrastructure that is not for all. And yeah, I acknowledge that there is a time scale, challenge here. You want short-term, basically benefit to the economy in terms of employment, and then there are questions around, larger scale interventions and whether they can make that sort of outcome. On that subject, I feel like I need to talk about the budget. The federal budget was released only a few weeks ago. The state budgets are, being released. Victoria is releasing their budget tomorrow. And if anything, I don't know about you, but from my perspective, especially when it comes to infrastructure, the federal budget was really underwhelming. And there is a reason that everyone is describing it as a business budget and not as an infrastructure budget. From our perspective, beyond the quantity of infrastructure funding, there is a lot of questions about the quality of infrastructure and what was not there. the absence of any basically attention to social housing, the absence of any kind of green infrastructure that can prepare us for climate change. These are the sort of issues that we cannot get over it. Yes, there was some sort of upgrade and maintenance mentality in the budget, which we welcome because they're very much overdue. But let's be honest, many of those construction jobs are also for men. So there is a gender issue to this kind of infrastructure approach. And last but not least, we found it very difficult to find any clear links between what was included in the infrastructure section of budget and what Infrastructure Australia has been advocating for years. We found it very difficult to see clear links between the priorities set by Infrastructure Australia, and let's be honest, that is their job, to show the priorities, and what was included in budget. On that note, I'll leave it to my colleague, Crystal Legacy, to continue the presentation. Crystal, you're on.
Thanks, Torrin. Okay, well, look, we can learn a lot from the past now, can't we? Learning from the past, here we are in a moment of recession. We use the word extraordinary, we throw it around without necessarily considering that the last time we had an infrastructure-led recovery was only about 10 years ago under the global financial crisis. Myself and many others wrote about that time. I wrote a paper called Infrastructure Planning in a State of Panic, and that's the concern at the moment, is that we are panicking and using discourse around creating jobs and returning to economic prosperity without really thinking through strategically what are we planning for and for whom, as Torrin described. So there's a real opportunity here to situate infrastructure governance planning and strategic planning within a broader social, environmental, and economic and cultural context upon which we tend to leave as neutral when we do infrastructure planning. So there's a real lesson there for us. To our next slide, please. This is a timely research agenda. Of course it is. Here we are situated at a time where national governments, including our state budget, we're going to have the Victorian state budget delivered tomorrow, and it's going to be very, very large, very, very ambitious. And one of the things that we draw to account and is at the center of our concern in this research agenda is what is the infrastructure governance model, a model that is both top down but certainly bottom up, and that is situated within a broader value system. What is it we're trying to do, and how are we trying to shape our cities? We know based on the great work of Diego Dodson that infrastructure does lead the structure of our cities, and we want to contest that by thinking about infrastructure in new and different ways over the course of this project. Next slide, please. So what do we want to do? So we want to develop, so our aim is to develop an infrastructure governance model or models that minimizes the incongruity between infrastructure strategic planning and the delivery of that planning or that infrastructure for Australian cities. It's obviously well timed. We are at this moment where infrastructure is at the center of much of the conversations in terms of planning policy. But our focus is not just infrastructure planning and its governance, but also the financing of infrastructure, which of course is drawn from multiple scales beyond, well and truly beyond Australia, but yet has very local impact. So very complex scale or dimensions that we need to take into account. We're also interested in this terminology, this term called social licensing, this idea that the work that we do, the work that governments do and their proponents needs to be situated within a context that is politically, socially, and culturally acceptable. It is situated within a broader discourse and conversation about the future of our cities. Social licensing allows us to think about how that is acquired over the course of a planning process that extends from early visioning of strategic thinking all the way down to project planning and its very important local impacts. We're going to be answering this question and guided by this aim through a series of mixed methods, a systemic literature review that the fantastic Rebecca Clemens is currently working on in collaboration with us, key informant interviews with policymakers from all scales of government, community groups, planners, and the political elite, of course. This is case study based research that we're going to be, that's going to drive this research agenda, situated both in New South Wales and also in Victoria. And we're hopefully going to also undertake a citizens survey. Next slide, please. Okay, so case study selections. This is the really exciting part of the project. Now, this is an ongoing discussion. We really look forward to hearing from you and any input and ideas that you might have, but we see this as a multi-sectoral case study. We want to make sure that we don't buy into the silo mentality and see the infrastructure as only transport or as only housing or as only placemaking. We want to see it across the full remit of what might constitute planning. So it's going to be comprehensive in its reach. And we're also interested in this idea of bundled infrastructure. We're not just looking at one or two things coming together. We want to think about it at a scale and at a sectoral, but also at a precinct level. We're interested in placemaking and the creating of communities as well. Next slide, please. So here are just some visual representations of what bundled infrastructure might generate in terms of an imaginary. I'm just thinking about this photo here of Melbourne. The blue lines, those are cycling routes, the inner city and the inner north here in Melbourne. Bundling that together, that very quickly becomes a very exciting mega infrastructure project, which is not another new big toll road, which is something we like to build a lot of here in Melbourne. Next slide, please. So here are our research questions. So I won't read them out to you because I am very aware of time. But the first one here is, to what extent does strategic planning and infrastructure planning align with the actual delivery of infrastructure? And the second one is, how can strategic planning for infrastructure be better aligned? So to what extent, and then how can we do it better? And breaking that down through a series of sub-questions to help guide our inquiry. Next slide, please. So next steps, well, the next steps is to, conduct the research. Here we go. Very much to participate in a series of policy discussions, a series of discussions, very importantly, embedded in communities. That's something that I know myself I'm very committed to, as well as a conversation with all of you about where we can take this research in this very early part of our journey together. And I believe that's it for me. I think the next slide is the big question mark. Do you have any questions for us?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Joanne and Crystal. That's very interesting. And yeah, just remind your viewers out there that this is the start of the project. It's been running for a couple of months now. The research fellows in place and has started work, but you know, there's a real chance to influence perhaps their directions, but also make some suggestions about such an important issue. And I think one of the interesting things we're going to hear from our incubator that's at the end of their process shortly, and they were looking at the question of housing for health, and infrastructure really turned up as an important issue for them, which will be part of their talk we'll hear shortly. But if we can just have a look at the chat, Andrew, and just see what we got in terms of some questions. Okay, there's people are telling us where they're from, which is exciting. But just wanted to talk a little bit about some questions that I actually got earlier in the day that came in when people were invited to register. And to around this first question, I found quite interesting. People wanted to know, there were two different questions, but they were sort of around the same issues. They wanted to know whether you were going to actually introduce an issue about the Aboriginal voice in infrastructure planning and delivery, because a lot of people are concerned, and particularly I think this question must have come from Melbourne with that road project and the issue around those very old trees. But whether your project's going to cover the issue of the Aboriginal voice in infrastructure planning. And secondly, there was another reader, I think it was from Sydney, who was complaining about the number of examples recently where governments have paid too much for land for infrastructure projects, and whether your project is going to look at anything in terms of improving methods for land acquisition in infrastructure.
I guess there are two questions here. You know, the one about the Aboriginal voice to infrastructure planning. and infrastructure decision making. The tree tragedy in Melbourne was really shameful. I don't think that there is anyone anywhere in Australia, you know, in the government system that would defend it. Some may tell you that, you know, by their practical mind or practical standards, you know, by the time that they realized how big of a deal that tree was, it was too late to do anything about it. I mean, that's the only defense that you can really expect to hear. And that goes back to not just having an Aboriginal voice to infrastructure planning. I also think that it's about Aboriginal voice to a strategic planning, which should come before our, you know, even infrastructure decisions. We have had conversations among ourselves around those, you know, main questions, you know, to whom, to what end. And as part of our emphasis and dedication to both actually climate justice and social justice, I actually think that any planning decisions on unceded land needs to be accounting for a strong Aboriginal voice. There is no other way to get planning right on unceded land. About your second question about land acquisition, there are a lot of questions around financialization of infrastructure. And one of the things that we have realized, even in these earliest steps, are about lack of data. So in many cases, business cases are not really public. In many cases, you hear about some of these issues a few years later as part of a, you know, corruption inquiry case, because they are not really shared with public. And I have to say that the financial planning part of infrastructure and its, you know, alignment or misalignment with the actual delivery and actual cost is definitely one of the three areas that we will be looking at in this project. But at least at this early stage, we are not confident how much we can address it versus how much we find ourselves in a position of just pointing out how muddy the water is. Because if the data is not available, if the business cases are not public, it's very difficult to scrutinize anything.
Sure, no, that's a good point. Now, I've got a question here from Heather Nesbitt, which I might direct towards Crystal, if you don't mind, Crystal. And Heather's asking, given recent events and strong public support, you know, which Heather's taking as a social license, will the project look at social infrastructure such as aged care, mental health, and community resilience infrastructure?
That's a really great question, Heather. Thank you. It's been very much a part of our discussions around the parameters of and the scope of the project, and hence why we've kind of landed on this idea of bundled infrastructure. We really want to look at multiple forms of infrastructure. We want care infrastructure, social infrastructure, as integral to thinking about the delivery. In part, we want to move away from just this siloed idea of mega transport or mega infrastructure. I mean, we're rarely interested in the discourse being led out of the Grattan Institute on that very question. We really want to challenge some of that, that a series of small projects can become bundled together to form mega infrastructure, which is something that our politicians tend to really like. They like the ribbon cutting thing. The other thing I just wanted to note, though, thinking a little bit about Victoria around the significance of the research that we're doing, is that it's not just a gap between strategic planning and project planning that's the problem here. The problem is also the way in which community engagement is conducted, which is absolutely, in the context in which I do my planning here in Victoria, is broken. So there's a real opportunity to truly rethink, and through an Indigenous lens, is a really strong and powerful and important starting point for us to start rebuilding that relationship between the community engagement and infrastructure planning in its fullest understanding.
I think that's a pretty important point, Crystal. And you know, certainly some people who participated in the festival in previous years were very concerned, say, for something like West Connects that had 4,400 submissions, most of which were quite critical of the project. And I think the community was pretty concerned that they didn't think they had a voice in what happened. We just got a time for a couple more questions. We've got a question here from that we've discussed a little bit last week in the festival. Do you think governments have enough evidence to inform infrastructure decisions given the pandemic and uncertainty about how people will use cities in the future? So will we commuting less? Will CBDs will be less important? Should we be looking at more local and regional infrastructure? Do you think that's an issue for your project going forward, Taran?
To be honest, I've said this quite a few times in the last few weeks. In Australia, we are in a very unique and lucky position. We are talking about post-pandemic time, and we are talking about recovery around the time that there are 600,000 new daily COVID cases reported around the world. So it sounds like the rest of the world will be struggling with the pandemic for months to come. I feel like that puts this unique position, puts also extra pressure on us in Australia to get it right, because the trend that we are starting will be followed and has to be, I mean, there is no other way, by the rest of the world when they find themselves in a position that the case numbers are under control and everything. And in a sense, what is happening right now in our cities is an indication of what may follow in other parts of the world. I feel like a lot of pre-COVID behaviors are already back, you know, in terms of the public transport usage rate, in terms of, you know, even going back to office, but with additional layer of flexibility, if you like. While we no longer have to avoid our office spaces, but we have learned throughout the COVID that you don't have to be there every day, you know, 9 to 5 to get work done. You know, we have learned a lot through our, you know, experience even with teaching, as much as we miss students and everything, but we've realized that there are other ways of, spreading the love and, you know, spreading the knowledge and all of that. I like to think that that flexibility will be something that we take forward with us. It may, for example, I mean, if we want to go back to our project, it may open conversations on having more inclusive, flexible modes of community engagement around infrastructure. I mean, we all have heard for years that, you know, community hall, you know, meetings don't work because they're only a certain, you know, social, you know, group that show up, you know, because of their timing and all of that. But we have learned through COVID that you can actually have, you know, large number of audience by alternative, you know, mode of communication after hours when no one, you know, has to miss because of work. So I like to think that some of this flexibility will get carried on. But if you're asking about the end of city, the end of public space, the end of, no, I don't think that this is the end of geography of any way. If anything, people actually miss social interaction. People miss public spaces and want to get back.
Okay, that's an interesting view. And for people that want to progress that debate further, Wednesday evening, we're trying to synthesize some of those views we've heard from previous weeks about what our cities will look like in the future. I'd also give a shout out in terms of infrastructure tomorrow at lunchtime. We've got Melody Ding talking about bicycles as a form of infrastructure that might generate some health benefits and also reduce some congestion in our cities. But look, can we just all put our virtual hands together and thank Taran and Crystal? Very interesting outline of your new incubator. We're very excited at the Trust about how things are going to roll, and we should catch the Festival of Urbanism next year and find out how your first year's gone. But thanks again, Crystal and Taran. And could I just now invite Associate Professor Tess Lee to join us in the Festival Urbanism studio, where we're going to hear from her incubator. Tess, just walk straight in here. We love to see you. Okay, so let me just quickly introduce Tess and her colleague, Dr. Liam Greeley, and then we'll get stuck right into their presentation. And I'll remind people that this is the end of Tess's incubator. Well, it's got about 4 or 5 months left to run. So we're might be interesting for Taran and Crystal to listen to a little bit about the process and the experience perhaps of that incubator. But Tess Lee is an anthropologist. She studies bureaucratic formations and she ponders why social policy is so hard to get right. And she's the author of a really excellent book called Wild Policy that I could recommend. But her research explores different manifestations of policy dysfunction under continuing settled occupation, where it occurs, to whom blame is ascribed, and how to intercept it. And very much her incubator has been around that interception role. She leads the Housing for Health Incubator in partnership with a not-for-profit organisation, Health Habitat. Now, also joining us, I think you're in Darwin at the moment, Liam. Probably doing more fieldwork. Never let a good researcher do some fieldwork in sunny Darwin. Liam's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Housing for Health Incubator. He's in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies here at Sydney University. And his incubator research is focused on housing and infrastructure policy, hence the connection with Taran's work in regional and remote Australia, and also, interestingly enough, Southeast Louisiana. So the way we're going to roll is a little bit like the previous session. Tess and Liam have a short presentation. Really interested to hear what they've got to say in that presentation. Then we'll have a chance for questions at the end, and feel free to bang those away in chat. And we'll see where we get to. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing Tessa's presentation, Andrew, we'll get into it. I think that's the previous one. Here we go. Excellent. Deep Impact Takes Dry Work, Festival Urbanism 7.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Peter and Tess? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so Tess and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country from which we speak today, the Larrakia people in Darwin and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, as well as the First Nations people on whose country our fieldwork has taken place. We pay respect to leaders past, present and emerging for their effort to respond to ongoing occupation on land where sovereignty was never ceded. We'd also like to note that, as Peter said, this is our final opportunity to present the work of the Housing for Health Incubator, and that this is a talk written in part to describe the importance of the Henry Halloran Trust's investments. So in the push by universities to prioritise impact, a key truth is often submerged. Deep impact takes sustained, dry, and often invisible work. Discussion of impact's twin, engagement, similarly understates the undramatic and time-consuming work required to effect change. It also neglects the importance of the seemingly pointless. Pointlessness, as in not done for research points, is key to authentic impact. The C words that now populate university discourse, collaboration, co-development, co-design, community consultation, and so on, are politically irrefutable. Take the term co-design. According to Emma Blomkamp, while this concept offers some innovations when in-depth partnerships are involved, in its more loosely defined application, to quote, any type of collaborative or participatory activity, almost everyone seems to be doing it, end quote. But even the most well-intentioned co-design processes can potentially be little more than playful inclusion exercises. Developing analyses that are radically contextualized and creating pathways for research to impact messy and unequal worlds requires trust and engagement. These take time to build through forms unrecognised by official impact registers. This is the importance of the incubator program. Since 2018, the Housing for Health Incubator has been pursuing work across three key questions. One, why is the consistent supply of routine repair and maintenance in Indigenous housing so hard to secure? Two, what can we do to assist the practical questions of our key partner, Health Habitat, in their ongoing work with Indigenous communities and organisations? And three, how can we understand infrastructural inequalities and policy cultures writ large? We've achieved multiple impacts which people can explore on our website. And where possible, we've drawn attention to these through the usual means, at research events, in public media, curating exhibitions, proclaiming new funding, and highlighting our publications. But equally significant impacts have often been off stage and out of sight. Answering our questions has demonstrated that the most useful labouring that researchers might do is often the least exciting or public. This is labour that crawls through data that can be hard to decipher, uncovering legislative detail that protects government departments from service obligations, SLAP maps that identify where infrastructure and amenity is and isn't planned, and service records that convey how corroding health hardware is or isn't responded to. These are just some of the items that must be tracked down to understand how infrastructural pasts determine present and future possibilities. These interrogations rarely provide the pleasures of ground-up research, reproduced subsequently as partnership tales from the field. Even so, we argue that such efforts are a key means by which academics can use their skill sets and professional status to help unwind forms of settler administrative damage, and a key benefit of the incubator program.
In some of the critical commentary on government delivery of housing in remote Indigenous communities, it's commonplace, as in, it's suggested to me a lot, to identify the failure to provide culturally appropriate housing. Now, there's good reasons for that kind of diagnosis, including repeated failures to design for local use, the crowding pressures, and the thermal design needs. And the inevitable conclusion then is that more and better community consultation is needed to determine culturally appropriate solutions. So far, so good, no arguments. But such critiques are often scant on the details of housing hardware requirements, the amenities, the plumbing, the wiring, and the networks which confer house function. And they're quiet on how something like good design may generate solutions that are so bespoke that they're later hard to maintain. They don't tell us about the processes involved in altering government housing tenders, or questions of expertise or labour or logistics. Yet these mundane issues we've found in our research are at the heart of housing design, degradation, and restoration. So our work took something of a different approach. What if, instead of exacerbating the burden of community consultation endured by remote community residents, or of assuming that front-end construction processes matter more than the maintenance that follows, we instead strengthened the standards that housing must meet and the protections that tenants should rightfully expect to live in safe and well-tended homes? What kind of work does that take? Thank you. This is something that our incubator has pursued with our partner Health Habitat. By doing such things as supporting the revision of the respected Housing for Health, the Guide. Formerly known as the National Indigenous Housing Guide, this resource provides detailed specifications of the materials, the hardware, and the installation processes required for sustainable housing in various environmental contexts, and it meets gaps in the mainstream National Construction Code of Australia. Now, we'd note that coordinating and hosting meetings to discuss whether the recommended standards of tap fittings and electrical outlets require updating, or if enough attention is paid to age and disability design, etc., is a form of engagement lacking immediately clear impact. It is unexciting, but it's necessary. Strategising how the guide can again assume significance to policymakers, who in turn can set detailed standards for housing tenders, offers genuine potential to consistently improve residents' living conditions. And even though, unlike a journal impact factor, influencing the attention paid to repairs and maintenance is difficult to see or measure, our investment in such activities rests on our founding assumption that appropriate housing is also housing that staves off breakdown through funded and planned repair and maintenance regimes. And we've achieved this by assisting Health Habitat's Housing for Health methodology to become embedded in government refurbishment programs, such as with the Northern Territory's government's new preventative repairs and maintenance scheme. So this invisible work is also work that the incubator has facilitated, and what we're saying is we think it's actually going to improve the lot of households across Australia, but it's not something that we can punch out for a track record or on a CV. Over to Liam.
Undertaking research only in the pursuit of university recognition is, of course, not the point. True impacts are the shared achievement of diverse coalitions, of courageous tenants, their advocates, sympathetic public servants, activists, industry allies, and motivated researchers. While grant and ethics applications require conventional outcomes promised prior to any investigation, legitimate revelations and an understanding of what to do with them emerge through relational work, where policy is understood as both the problem and a tool to leverage solutions, one of many. Nor has our relational work typically been so technically focused or even directed towards obviously practical ends. The value and privilege of the incubator model that the Henry Halloran Trust has supported has been the capacity to pursue inquiries and collaborations without the demand for immediate impact. This is not to put an argument about knowledge for its own sake, but rather a claim that useful or innovative insights emerge through a variety of exploratory and open-ended endeavours and will often require broad-based support to become actionable. To illustrate, our collaboration with the artist collective Snack Syndicate began and continues as a reading group called Infrastructural Inequalities. It's also produced an experimental online journal exhibiting the writing of mostly early career researchers. Our most public output was a 2-day program at Artspace in Woolloomooloo, comprising an exhibition, curated lectures and panels that brought artists and media producers into conversation with academics and the Health Habitat Network. This work is about fostering critical publics, whose members may not be at the coalface of remote R&M programs, but whose expertise and social capital can strengthen any strategy for proposed solutions. The point here is that work that might be rendered ancillary to incubator achievements is as important to its impact as the narrow cluster of conventional academic outputs that do officially count: research, publication, citation metrics, grant income, and so on. With the Civic Studio in New Orleans, to take another example, the Mixed Media Project, represented on the slide, examined the work of the New Orleans Sewerage and Water Board to keep that sinking city dry. It directed attendees at the 4S Science and Technology Studies Conference to the history of New Orleans and its contemporary infrastructural challenges through a field trip to the Carrollton Water Treatment Plant. And it represented the labour of Sewerage and Water Board employees in an 8-page lift-out in New Orleans' major daily newspaper, The Advocate. Urban designer Aaron Chang was central to that work. Of course, the excitement of the public event or the beauty of published photography masks the administrative, logistical and social labour of pulling such things into being. But the work of engaging existing reading publics in their homes or building new critical publics in non-university spaces is markedly more impactful than any paywalled journal article. Effective impact and engagement, of course, generates more hidden work: ethics applications, research agreements, budgeting, reporting, and so on. And it requires building a public profile to sculpt public discourse through strategic partnerships and work with media professionals. For issues important to the incubator, this has often resembled small-scale campaigning, briefing journalists on how to effectively narrate the slow decay of government negligence in ways that are both attuned to complexity and which might interrupt the apathy of low expectations for remote Indigenous service provision. Over to you, Tess.
Thanks, Liam. So as university funding available for remote fieldwork has atrophied, and not just because of COVID, the founding of the incubator gave us valuable leveraging capacity. We've since received major grants from the former New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and the Australia Research Council, effectively multiplying trust funds by 2.5 for every dollar. Importantly, our wins are also deeply dependent on our faculty research and finance support staff. The simple point we're making is this: no success, no meaningful impact or engagement is achieved without shared efforts. Even when those successes must be revisioned into narratives of individual academic achievement for the purpose of claiming a track record, these are always collective accomplishments, and the trust model actually allows for this. For another example, in 2018, the incubator responded to calls to investigate a water contamination incident in Borroloola in the Northern Territory. Some of our fellow researchers at the University of Sydney questioned the connection that we were then drawing between housing and water. Because these are distinct policy fields and activist networks that are not typically thought of together, people thought we were being a bit odd. This research, in which our colleague Kirsty Howie is also central, would in fact lead to all 4 Northern Territory land councils calling for a Safe Drinking Water Act, and to the establishment of new ministerial portfolios for Indigenous essential services and water security. Now, we couldn't have forecast this, but we knew enough to understand that water security is key to safe and healthy housing, and so we persisted with these off-topic interrogations. Many of the steps, despite the watery topic, were time-consuming and dry. The conclusion that there are no minimum protections for safe drinking water in Northern Territory remote communities required sifting through under-analysed legislation, licence agreements, a memorandum of understanding, a customer contract, and numerous arcane reports, which I would say were designed not to be read. Activating the findings is the basis now for public talks and media interviews and less visible continuing land council and ministerial briefings, submissions, workshops, even a presentation to the Productivity Commission, and behind the scenes strategy talk with diverse allies. Now, it would be misleading to characterise such research as collaborative if this implies some equal input in developing research questions and investigating answers. Where it has concerned regional and remote Indigenous communities, our work has been underpinned by deep, authentic existing relationships with residents and the expertise of relevant service providers, but the truth is neither group has consistently contributed to what we might claim as outputs. Instead, and I think this is important, what we're stressing about the liberation of the incubator model, we've often assumed the role of strategic allies at the request of partners with different skills or time pressures. Now, for the artist Miriam Charlie, who you're seeing on your screen, this meant we secured a Northern Territory Arts grant for her to photograph Borroloola housing. For Civic Studio in New Orleans, whose work you saw earlier, it meant supporting the development of a participatory framework for that collective. And for Health Habitat, it's meant acting as their research advisor and quietly connecting that NGO back into new government programs, and otherwise applying our skills as knowledge and policy brokers, including by calling in other experts as needed, sharing the expertise, not being selfish about it. So the work that needs to be done is not always the visible work, noted for collaborations. It means reading unfriendly materials and doing due diligence with grey literatures. Now, such work, I hope we've shown, is not at odds with playful, speculative and collaborative endeavours. Not at all. Instead, we assert that these pursuits mutually benefit one another. Nonetheless, while the work we have done does not match conventional case studies of collaboration, co-development or co-design, it's not been pointless. Instead, it's been necessary to subvert the opacity of governing systems and to effect meaningful change in the process. I'm really proud of what we've done. And while we don't know how someone like Peter Phibbs might phrase all of this for acquitting trust investments, we think it's what makes the incubator program so effective. It puts trust in researchers and it lets them find their way to driving impact. And we thank you for it. Thank you.
Well, Tess and Liam, thanks very much. That was a very interesting presentation. And oh my God, have you guys been on a journey for 3 years? And you know, as someone was there at the start of your process, I am so proud of what you guys have done.
Yeah.
You've really provided, I think, what the Trust is all about. We're a very unconventional research funding body. We actually aren't incredibly interested in all the small print and the footnotes and, you know, the method you're going to use on day 173 of your research project. We want to know that it's an important project that is going to do some good.
Yeah.
And we also just want to make sure that we've got some researchers who know what they're doing, and then we're really happy to give them some trust to find their way through that maze. And some of the things that your incubator got involved with maybe wasn't, you know, at the top of our mind at the start of the process, but looking particularly around that work around drinking water in the NT and the respect I think you've gained amongst land councils and other parts of the community in Northern Territory as a very effective agent of change that's knowledge-based, but also demonstrate a lot of policy skills is really a fantastic outcome for the Trust, and we thank you for it. So let's interrupt our love fest here on the stage of the Festival of Urbanism and just see if we've got any questions coming in from the audience. Now, the question I'm going to start with, Tess, is while we're giving people a chance to pound away on the chat, is what advice would you give to our new incubator? Okay, there's a bit of overlap there. You both ended up doing infrastructure. Anything that you know after the end of your sort of incubator journey that might be useful to Joanne and Crystal this evening?
One of the things that I was really stressing here is that for community impact, researchers are in this unique position of actually having the time, the paid time, to do the work that community groups can't do, or that either because it is time consuming or because this stuff is difficult to digest. And I think the world of planning and infrastructure in particular lends itself to academic deep dives. And those deep dives are necessary because, to be frank, a lot of infrastructural legacies are also stories of corruption. They're stories where capital has been sunk in different ways and seems to prefigure what's possible for different community futures. And unpeeling that, unfurling that and exposing that for what it is, rather than constantly suggesting it's all de novo, open to change, open to possibility. I think it's really, that's the benefit. And to put that much more simply, if academics could see community engagement as also, this is the point of our talk, as also stuff you do at the desk, then I think that's the gift that we can bring back. So yes, privilege those consultations. Yes, privilege the public events. You must get that public profile early. Don't neglect it. But don't also second guess the importance of doing what academics are skilled at doing, which is deconstructing arcane literatures and understanding what's going on and then representing that to publics in a simple form so that everyone can understand what's going on and have a debate about it. Yeah.
No, thanks for that, Tess. We've got a question there from Nicole, which is now that the Housing for Health Incubator, I think, has been thoroughly incubated, where to next? What's your life past the Trust Incubator look like, Tess?
Well, as mentioned, we have a Australia Research Council Special Research Initiative grant. We're really, again, thank you, Incubator and the Halloran Trust, because we were able to leverage the work we'd done and be one of 7% of applicants in this scheme to actually get a grant. And that grant is looking more deeply at this issue of legacy infrastructures and how they do or don't enable different community futures. So it is a question that's got a future orientation, but by looking at what are the swag of things that have that preordain some of what's dragging people or holding them in place right now. It's an extension of what we've done in this work, which is not only to continually talk about repair and maintenance, which has been key to the Housing for Health approach. It takes that into a different step, which is to say, what are people dealing with, and who's responsible for it? That's the second question, because abandonment, I think, is the next part of how do you force communities to go into modes of retreat, unplanned retreat, if you like, through forms of just neglect, or you've got legacy infrastructure in place, nobody's taking responsibility for it, there's lead in the water as a result, therefore that community won't actually get new housing in the future. Like, all of these things kind of come together. So that's what the work that we're doing in the future.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, all the best with that. But look, this is almost a related question from, I think, one of your colleagues, Tess, Elspeth Probyn, who really appreciated your presentation and your work. But the term trust comes up a lot. Have you got any ideas of how we can get that into our government and uni-based funding schemes?
Well, I would like our government and uni-based funding schemes to learn from the Henry Halloran Trust, because we've just, not to return to that Love Fest, or maybe to return to the Love Fest, but what I am trying to underline and emphasise, it's been unique. I used to run a research centre on soft money. I had 50 staff. Like, I know the game of trying to pull that stuff into place. And it's been absolutely unique to be given the startup impetus and enabling capacity, and then just trusted. So the word trust, yes, trusted to get on with it without being burdened by this necessity to come up with a swag load of unachievable KPIs just to get the money in the first place. And I mean, there was a little tweet going around a little while ago that, and I think it might actually be modelled on something that a European country is actually thinking of doing, which is you load up the researchers with the money that they need to begin with and let them do it. You don't make, then after that they can start competing for funds.
Yeah, that's an idea I'm sure the academics in the audience will be getting right across their test. But we've just got one last question we've got time for, which is coming about, and this might be a question for both of you. But how do you manage the project in a way so it doesn't get too big? You know what I mean? Like, there's lots of worthy things, I guess, you could be doing in the Housing for Health space. At any point you sort of feel a bit overwhelmed, Tess, and you thought you might be biting off more than you could chew in your incubator?
Every single day. So I can see Liam grinning and nodding. So Liam, do you want to take that one?
Apart from overwork, I think, really practically, insofar as our project extended from thinking about housing to thinking about the intersecting infrastructures on which safe housing depends, I think we have sort of cordoned off our focus to attend to debates and histories around water infrastructure, and have done much less on other things that we might have been reading, energy infrastructures, waste infrastructures, that are equally important and we've probably dabbled in. I think it has become bigger, or certainly different to the original, application that I wasn't a part of and that Tess wrote up. Certainly there's been more emphasis on work in the US context, but I think that, one of the benefits of the incubator, contra many other grants that have much shorter timeframes, is that you're able to do that comparative work that pays dividends that aren't immediately evident. So, when you're talking about Indigenous housing or anything in remote communities, one of the key lessons that Health Habitat has shown all through their work for the last 3 decades has been the reason houses fall apart is not about tenants, it's about insufficient repair and maintenance. And in a similar way, debates around remote communities and the failures of infrastructures often get framed as, you know, the challenge of remoteness, rather than all these other factors that contribute to failure, which are about particular populations being served, which are about tenders, which are about logistics, and looking at other contexts that aren't remote in the same way and finding how those things are similar and different, as well as like what are effective intervention strategies and tactics, has been really useful. So I think you sort of have to let it get too big and then pull back in, and you just jettison some stuff that you started and will never get to finish, and hopefully you get another grant and, you know, keep your career ticking along. That's the, you know.
Okay. Very important to keep your career ticking along, Liam. But look, that's all we've got time for in the incubator studio. But can we put our virtual hands together for Tess and Liam? That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm really excited as someone that sat in the room with Tess, what must be 3 years ago now, Tess, where you presented on this project, and wow, has it come a long way in 3 years? And I'm sure my colleagues in the Trust will be just as excited about what you've been up to. Anyway, that's all we've got time for at Incubator Night. Can I just give a shout out to the future events of the Trust? We've got an excellent panel on Wednesday evening, and on Thursday, we've got the 8th annual Henry Halloran lecture, where we're hearing from Ian Mulhern, looking at the exciting issue of housing policy. I hope you can join us then. Everyone have a very good evening. This is over and out from downtown Festival Urbanism.